Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just leave it a few more moments for people to join and then we'll get started. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what is going to be our fourth edition of our webinar series on the current conflict in the Middle East. So, similar to previous weeks, if you've missed any of our other webinars, these are available on our Middle East hub, along with other reports and publications pertaining to the situation. This week, we're looking at the aims and objectives of Iranian political and military leaders, the scenarios and options available to the US going forward. And we'll be going through what conflict indicators we're going to be watching as the conflict moves into its next phase. If you have any questions, as ever, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we've got some time at the end to answer all of your questions. We might not be able to get through all of them though, but we'll give it our best shot. As mentioned, this is our fourth edition of this webinar, and this is likely to be the last in our current weekly cadence. But obviously, as we are closely monitoring the situation, we are intending on running further briefings following significant developments, incidents, or events. When these are organized, the times and dates of these will be communicated both directly to you and via our social media channels. So joining us this week, we have the return of Rob Walker, Director of Government Assistance here at Helix, and Alice Duman, a Regional Intelligence Analyst specializing in the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm Andrew Devereux, Global Risk Intelligence Manager here at Helix. So Alice, we'll start off with you today. Could you give us a situation briefing on the current situation and any updates on what's changed in the past week?
Of course. So what we continue to see is a shift in the character of the conflict. So what started as a high-intensity military exchange, with Iran firing large waves of missiles and drones at US bases, has evolved into something more complex, and targets are becoming more strategically chosen to cause economic disruption. So Iran's overall rate of fire continues to decrease since the outset of war on the 28th of February, but Iran's targeting is increasingly mirroring that of Israeli and US targets in Iran, and is therefore becoming more economically disruptive to the Gulf. So a point of escalation came on the 18th of March with Israel's strike on Iran's South Pars gas field. Iran had been striking Gulf energy infrastructure since the opening days of the conflict, but 18th March marked the first deliberate attack on Iranian energy. And Iran's immediate and broad retaliation against Gulf energy sites was qualitatively heavier than anything we've seen in the preceding weeks. So Qatar's Ras Laffan, which is the world's largest LNG facility, suffered extensive damage, and this forced Qatar to declare force majeure. Iran also hit Saudi Arabia's Yanbu terminal on the Red Sea, and Kuwait's refineries at Min Al Ahmani and Abdullah Port were also struck again. The South Pars attack has kind of escalated the energy war, and we saw this directly in Brent crude prices spiking the next day. The second major development came on the 22nd, when two Iranian ballistic missiles penetrated Israel's David Sling air defense system, and they landed in Dimona and Arad, which are next to Israel's Negev nuclear research center. This attack came in direct retaliation for the US's strikes against Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. The same day, Hezbollah launched 85 attack waves, which is the highest in a single day since the start of the conflict. And this targeted northern Israel as well as IDF units operating in southern Lebanon. As well as this, there's been repeated Iranian strikes on the US Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. There's been claimed strikes on the US Embassy logistics base in Baghdad. Drones have been intercepted near Erbil Airport, and an F-35 was forced to make an emergency landing after being hit, which is likely the first confirmed damage to a fifth-generation aircraft in the conflict. The USS Ford has also left combat operations on the 18th, and it's headed to Crete for reparations, and this has reduced the coalition military power in the region. If we kind of zoom out, there have been three broad trends. So the first is that there's a clear shift from ballistic missiles to drones. Iranian ballistic missile launches are down roughly 90% since the start of the conflict. And I think this is partly because stockpiles are genuinely depleted, and partly because Iran is likely rationing what's left. But drone attacks have become steady and a persistent tool of Iranian pressure. The second is that energy and power infrastructure have become a primary battlefield as a deterrence measure. So Iran has shown that it will directly retaliate against infrastructure that the US and Israel target. And this is particularly evident in the IRGC statement that said, we are determined to respond to any threat at the same level as it creates in terms of deterrence. If you hit electricity, we hit electricity. The third is that diplomacy is becoming more active, but not yet more effective. So on the 23rd, President Trump announced a 5-day pause on US strikes against Iran's power infrastructure. And he cited that negotiations with or discussions with Tehran were productive. Iran publicly denies any talks taking place. Pakistan has offered to host direct negotiations and has reportedly passed along the US's 15-point framework to Iran. But none of this has actually slowed the conflict. But what we're seeing currently is that there are more diplomatic avenues open and taking place than there have been at any point in the conflict before. So overall, we're not seeing the conflict winding down, but what we're seeing is the conflict is kind of changing form. We've moved from mass bombardment to targeted economic warfare and from purely military confrontations to a landscape where there's diplomacy, coercive pressure, and military escalations happening in tandem. And looking forward, the next key moment is the 27th of March, when the US's deadline for a deal and the pause on grid attacks is going to expire. How both sides act after that deadline is going to tell us whether this period will, be the start of escalation or de-escalation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alice. A lot to unpack there, and I think was just writing down some notes there. One thing that I picked up is that we're starting to see the same major themes come up each week. So, for instance, the finite nature of projectiles that move from missiles to drones as the character of the conflict has evolved is certainly something that we've spoken about in previous weeks. How critical the role of oil and energy is in this conflict as well. So, if anyone didn't watch it, Spencer spoke at length about how critical oil is in this conflict last week. So we covered that if you want to see that. But obviously, this is going to be a theme that we keep seeing week on week. And we're also going to be talking a bit later on about the move towards the diplomacy, how realistic this is, what are but all parties trying to achieve by this. So thank you, Alice. As mentioned as well, this week we're going to be focusing on on Iranian political and military leadership. Among much of the sort of contradictory and inconsistent information we've seen during this conflict, one element that is not up for discussion is the Iranian political system that existed prior to the conflict is still standing. So, Rob, could you cover for us how the regime is surviving, whether it has the resources and internal capital to survive long term, and the ways and means available to it to continue its military operations of disruption, economic leverage, and ultimately, as mentioned before, existential survival?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. We talked a couple of weeks ago about US objectives, which I think we agreed were primarily focused on limited but specific military objectives to disrupt Iran's capability, but then with a kind of corollary, which was that would in some way modify the regime's behavior, if not actually change the regime itself. I don't think much has happened in the last 2 weeks since we talked about that to change that assessment, other than to note, as Alice said, is that there has been a shift away from targeting bases to targeting civil infrastructure and threats to power generation and even desalination plants, which we mentioned as an indicator of escalation a couple of weeks ago. And I think we now have a fairly clear picture of what the Iranian government is hoping to achieve, and it's basically the diametric opposite of what the US stated or inferred objectives are. So the priority, as it has been since 1979, is regime survival. And I think for the purposes of this exercise, that means an identifiably Islamic and revolutionary government with a supreme leader, a ruling council with an identifiably continuous ideology, a basic control of all of the institutions of that regime, from the religious police to the IRGC to public ministries able to provide basic essential services to its core supporters. And anything that resembles that is remaining if and when the US suspends its operations will be spun as a success for Iran, I think. And it will probably be perceived as such by large parts of the world, although perhaps there'll be a reluctance to recognize that in some North Atlantic quarters. So regime survival is the big one. Other objectives which effectively support and contribute to that objective are in rough order of priority: to maintain its regional influence through its network of proxies in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and further afield, and to use those to continue to impose costs on the US and their allies and their interests in the Gulf and the wider region. They want to preserve their key strategic capabilities, including the nuclear program, the long-range strike capabilities through ballistic missiles and the UAV stockpile that Alice mentioned earlier, and also its remaining irregular forces, so fast attack boats, mini subs, mining capabilities, and so forth. And I think also very importantly, it wants to retain the reputation and freedom of action of the IRGC's Quds Force. That so far has not been felt tangibly in the Iranian government's response, but its ability to stage sabotage or disruptive attacks globally, not just through the regional proxies that it trains, equips, and directs. And also crucially, they want through those to retain some escalation options and even build escalation advantage. And I think we are seeing some signs of that through the recent escalation which Alice referred to. So it needs to preserve those capabilities so it continue to credibly threaten US interests with attack, and also its ability to impose costs on the neighbors, so it can counter US threats of escalation, as Alice set out very clearly. It also wants to be able to deter the widening of the conflict in the sense of the use of ground forces, which has been a source of some speculation, particularly in the last couple of days with the orders relating to the 82nd Airborne Brigade. But we can come on to that a bit later. I think all of those things also point to an abiding Iranian interest in ending the conflict on at least minimally favorable terms, such as those that it currently enjoys. And those diplomatic initiatives that Alice mentioned earlier continue all the way through. And there's almost certainly been a lot of back-channel discussions through intelligence agencies as well. And all of those capabilities from a diplomatic perspective emphasize Iran's ability to continue imposing costs on the US. Interestingly, I see today they're also, through the diplomatic channel, they've just said that actually they'd quite like to deal with J.D. Vance, not with Witkoff and Kushner, because those two people have betrayed and are not faithful negotiating partners. And I think that talks to their ability to identify potential splits within US domestic politics to their own advantage and to the advantage of their allies as well. And I don't think finishing it soon is particularly in the current interests of the US government, and certainly not the Israeli government as they currently stand. So I think that just contributes to the point we made 3 weeks ago, which is that conflict termination here is going to be pretty untidy, even if there is a formal diplomatic settlement. So there you go.
Thank you very much, Rob. Just from my own notes as well, I think it's very interesting, especially after the decapitation strategy that we've talked about previously and the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei on basically the first day of the conflict. We've now seen that Iran is able to endure because of this decentralized structure that it's adopted. So multiple power brokers who are very influential. So you mentioned the IRGC there being a huge one, which is almost a parallel state within the system. Obviously, this makes the Iranian system difficult to destroy. But in your opinion, long term, does this mean that it can actually ensure basic governance sort of beyond the use of force? Can it actually govern Iran once this conflict is over?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose that's about maintaining the credibility of the regime, and obviously there's a lot of interests externally that are focused on undermining that credibility. But I mean, it is, as you say, it's decentralized. I mean, they've split up IRGC command into what what we've said before, this kind of mosaic of about 35 different independent commands. The same will be true of other people in the ministries and the overlap between the two. So I think they will retain some ability. I mean, the attempt to destroy the civil infrastructure by the US is, as Alice said earlier, it was met with a response, and then the product of that was arguably the product of that is that 5-day pause that Trump offered. So, but it's very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to assess a government like Iran in terms of their credibility. What I would point out, though, is that we're now nearly 4 weeks in, and I would be very surprised if any of the coalition planners or US-Israeli planners had a best case scenario that involved the government of Iran still looking as resilient as it currently appears to be, and so I think that's probably the most useful lens at looking at sort of progress and success and the resilience of the government. I think the people trying to undermine its credibility would have hoped to have had a bit more success by this stage.
Absolutely. And just one final question. You mentioned diplomacy, and we spoke a couple of weeks ago about the sort of the deliberate ambiguity the US political leaders sort of have been trying to espouse throughout this conflict in terms of, do we know their goals? Do we know their objectives? If the public don't, then the enemy can't. Do you think that Iranian political leaders are doing the same thing at the moment with their outright denial of any negotiations with Trump or his team or anyone like that? Is that again the other side trying to play this sort of deliberate ambiguity in terms of their aims and motivations?
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I mean, there's a huge amount of value in appearing not to need to negotiate, and so obviously they've got an interest in saying that, but it has the force of credibility, right? And it does set people speculating, particularly when you have relatively contradictory statements coming out of the US government anyway. It just amplifies that sense of uncertainty for all of the people looking and potentially being inspired by it.
I suppose in another sense, it's also a projection of strength, isn't it? If you're the party who is not calling for negotiations, it projects the image that you are the ones most comfortable with the current direction and trajectory of the conflict as well.
Yeah, quite. And I think we mentioned a couple of weeks ago the idea of an escalation trap, and I think I think we're definitely seeing signs of that trap here with the US looking for additional pressure points, whether they're military or diplomatic or economic. It is clearly trying a range of options that I suspect it didn't anticipate having to do at this stage 4 weeks ago.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rob. And moving on, each week we've been looking at 3 key assessments. This week, as this is our last weekly webinar, we're going to expand that out to 5 key assessments. So, Alice, could you please go through our 5 key assessments and judgments from this week?
Of course. So some of our key analytical judgments are as follows. So the first one is that we're still seeing real potential for escalation. Over the past week, Trump has issued increasingly forceful warnings against Iran, saying he would massively blow up Iran's South Pars field if Iran escalates further. He's also said that the US is going to obliterate Iran's power infrastructure if the Strait of Hormuz isn't reopened. And then in turn, Iran has responded by saying that any strike like this would trigger retaliation on the energy and water systems in the Gulf, as Rob said. So what we're seeing is that both sides are trying to gain, or in their perceptions, keep the upper hand, which raises the risk of both miscalculation and escalations, but it's also going to be deepening the mistrust between the US and Iran. And we've already seen Israeli strikes hit fuel depots around Tehran, and Iran has targeted energy sites across the Gulf, as well as in Iraq and Israel. And the IEA now estimates that more than 40 energy facilities across 9 countries have been severely or very severely damaged. So the Strait of Hormuz is like central here. It moves, 20% of global oil, 25% of LNG, and about a third of global seaborne fertilizer. So Iran's effective closure of the strait, combined with strikes on alternative Gulf export routes, such as the Yanbu terminal, and then towards Saudi Arabia's eastern province, where oil and energy reserves are, this is working to block key export channels for Gulf oil. So we're in a position where even if a ceasefire happened tomorrow, Iran has said that the strait may not return to the pre-war status. And then when we look at fertilizer and global food security, the picture is also similar. Fertilizer production and logistics reportedly take weeks to restart, and farmers in the Northern Hemisphere should be planting currently. So delays that are ongoing are actually going to mean lower yields, higher food prices, and greater food insecurity. And some analysts say that this is going to actually persist into the coming 6 to 12 months. So what we're seeing is that every extra week that the strait is closed is locking in these structural damages, which aren't going to be quickly undone, even if we see, a full and immediate ceasefire on the 27th, although that's, of course, very unlikely. And then if we move on to negotiations, so what we've seen this week is that back channel and indirect diplomacy is active. Pakistan, Oman, Turkey, and Egypt are all involved. And as I've said previously, Pakistan's even offered to host talks this week. The US framework being passed through Pakistan, though, is reported to be very, very similar to the earlier proposals. And Iran has, of course, already rejected this. So there is a complication there. And then there's another complication in Iran's leadership shift. So the new supreme leader hasn't actually engaged with the US. And we're in a position where it's unclear whether other Iranian officials have the authority to impose commitments that the IRGC would respect. So while diplomatic activity is ongoing, the gap between both sides' positions does remain wide. So the most plausible short-term outcome isn't a full peace deal, but it's likely to be a partial face-saving arrangement around the Strait of Hormuz. And I'd say that Trump's 5-day pause on the strikes appears to be a test of whether, this space exists. And that's why the coming 48 hours in the lead up to the 27th of March deadline is going to be very telling about this. And then if we move on to Iran's projectile arsenal, so at the start of the conflict, Iran launched nearly 480 ballistic missiles in a single day. And then by day 10, that fell to around 40. And the US CENTCOM confirms that there are now, or Iranian launches are now 90% down from their peak. So while this does matter, what matters more is actually Iran's shift in tactics. We've seen that they're relying heavily on drones, which are cheaper, harder to intercept, and are built from a more dispersed supply chain. So this makes it difficult for the US and Israel to actually disrupt these supply chains. And Iran has also showed that while it might be running out of its missile arsenal, it still does have the capability when it chooses to use it. When we saw this in the strikes in Dimona and Arad, and then the Hadera power plant in Israel earlier today. So the threat hasn't disappeared, but it seems to have changed. Iran's ability to fire large missile salvos is likely permanently degraded, but the sustained drone pressure, if the conflict continues, is actually a more difficult challenge for the Gulf, because air defenses are going to continually be depleting. And we might get to a position where, Gulf countries are going to have to become selective about which incoming threats they want to intercept. And this depletion on both sides is arguably one of the strongest reasons why a ceasefire before stockpiles become critically low should take place. But on the other hand, Iran knows this, and its drone strategy is designed to exploit this. If we then move to US troop deployment, so 2 Marine expeditionary units are moving towards the region. And while President Trump has said he's not putting troops anywhere, he's also said that if he were, he wouldn't announce it. And I think this ambiguity is very intentional. So these developments are mainly interpreted to, increase pressure on Iran and shape the diplomatic landscape. But at the same time, they do carry real operational weight, as these forces, can conduct limited ground actions if they are ordered to do so. And then finally, if we look at the Hezbollah-Israel front, this is largely now operating on its own terms. So it's separate from the US-Iran-Israel dynamic. And the developments along the Lebanon-Israel border are being driven by Israel's view that this is a continuation of the war that was paused in November 2024 when the ceasefire took place. But this means that regardless of what happens in Iran, Israel is actually likely to continue pursuing its military objectives in Lebanon.
Thank you very much, Alice. I've just been struck by, especially when you were going over the escalation scenarios, how we've done this webinar for 4 weeks now, and each week the outlook gets particularly bleaker. So thank you very much. I completely agree with some of those key assessments, and I think we're going to touch on them a little bit more in our forecasting, which is coming up very soon. So moving on to our indicators. Similar to previous weeks, we've kept the same table and structure in this. As we mentioned, in terms of aerospace threats, Alice just went into detail about this. That shift in Iranian tactics has meant that missile fire has decreased by more than 92% from its day one peak. So this is still occurring, and obviously this is still an enduring and limited threat to especially Gulf countries. It's still occurring, but at much lower volumes. And in terms of airspace and air travel availability, international airlines have still extended flight suspensions to the region, but that's not a particular surprise. Flight disruption to those operating in the region is continuing. Availability is limited and subject to change, but there are still options available despite the fact that there is low availability. Border operations, there's been little change here. Outside of live conflict zones, these are broadly operating as normal. In terms of positive diplomatic signals, we've kept this as deteriorating because although the statements have said limited negotiations have taken place, details are unclear. It's had a fairly minimal impact on conflict trajectory, and the veracity of these negotiations is yet to be unpacked. We'll have a much better idea of this in the next 2 or 3 days. In terms of critical infrastructure, we've moved this from being an indicator of improvement to neither improving nor deteriorating. There's been no critical impact so far, but as the conflict is starting to focus upon this, particularly if both Iranian, US, or Israeli strikes start to target energy, information technology, or particularly desalination facilities in the Gulf, there is a chance that this could rapidly deteriorate. In terms of cyber threats, there's been reports of Iranian-backed cyber threats, but these have had little to no impact on the conflict trajectory itself. Government regulations, no change here either. The government advisories in the Middle East broadly are advisory rather than mandatory, with no actual movement restrictions or limitations on day-to-day activities. Travel advisories, these remain highly restrictive related to travel across the Middle East. And in terms of the embassy footprint, this remains incredibly limited, with visa services and other consular services limited across the Middle East for all Western embassies and consulates. So we have also decided to slightly change how we're looking at forecasting this week. We're looking at 3 main scenarios, which we are going to unpack, 3 possible scenarios. These are mostly looking at the options available to the US. As Alice mentioned, we will have a better idea of which scenario is most likely following the 27th of March, and that deadline that President Trump has imposed on positive negotiations with the Iranians, which means that they have currently delayed hitting Iranian infrastructure and energy infrastructure. So we believe that conflict continuation is the most likely scenario. And this is predicated on the assumption that President Trump does not escalate following the 27th of March deadline. This deadline is either eased or ignored. As we've seen, red lines can change throughout a conflict like this, and that is well within the current playbook of the United States. Obviously, President Trump has made positive noises about negotiation with Iran, even though that we are not seeing those positive noises from Iran itself. It's unclear if these talks are legitimate, who they're with, whether this is another tactic to reduce oil prices. but it is still at least a positive diplomatic signal. Recent statements about an expensive prize, we're assuming that to be the safe passage for some vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, are likely attempts to show progress, but claims that Iran has agreed to dismantle its nuclear program, for instance, seem highly, highly unlikely. In this scenario, both the US and Israel will continue their current targeting pattern. The proto negotiations continue, but with limited progress. And the US and Iran seek to end the conflict, but on their own terms. As we've mentioned, this scenario will produce more cost, more civilian pain, more disruption, less certainty on the future of the Strait of Hormuz, and could drag all parties into a prolonged war of attrition, where although key energy infrastructure is not hit, all parties continue the current air-based conflict. As mentioned, this is very much predicated on the US and Iran seeking to end the conflict on their own terms and to be able to portray it domestically as a win, even though that these basically incompatible negotiation positions persist. Secondly, we have conflict escalation. So this scenario looks at what escalation would look like if the US decides that this is the only route to a decisive victory. Realistically, this is embedded within conflict continuation. This is that the 27th of March deadline comes and the US decides that in order to achieve a decisive victory and be able to sell this as a decisive victory, the US needs to do something beyond the current activities of the conflict. This could take numerous guises. So the US could follow through with their intended operation to hit Iranian power plants. Obviously, they've already stated this is an option they're considering. We've heard a lot over the last few days about boots on the ground on Karg Island, as obviously this is a key Iranian oil export terminal. The logistics of this would be incredibly challenging from an assault perspective, as would holding the territory in the short to medium term in any meaningful way. But it looks like the US are not taking this off the table, whether this is an actual threat or whether this is just a negotiating strategy, we don't know. Air escalation is obviously more likely than ground escalation. And if this conflict becomes protracted, then the potential for escalation also rises. We could even see, as mentioned a couple of weeks ago, a commando strike trying to either capture or degrade enriched uranium sources. But again, the logistics of an assault on the interior of Iran would be dangerous, evocative, and a massive risk for the US to take. And the question is, would the US escalate to put the global energy market more at risk than it is already? This also goes against the stated goal of protecting the Middle East allies by prolonging their pain. This would essentially be sold as escalation to achieve de-escalation. But Iran has already shown it has an incredible ability to absorb pain. They could just endure even more economic pain if there was an escalation of this nature. And then the question also is, what if Iran escalates as well and follows through on those threats to hit desalination facilities in the Gulf, which would cause an immediate and extensive impact on Gulf countries. And the third scenario, which we have said is the most unlikely, is conflict cessation. So it's obviously still within the playbook of President Trump to just announce a decisive victory without giving further details and claiming that there is information the US has about how critically wounded Iran is that isn't publicly available. The complexities of the negotiations means these are highly unlikely to bring out some sort of definitive end to the conflict. And we've talked about before, what does the end of the conflict even refer to? Iran and Israel in particular could continue these intermittent airstrikes with the possibility of conflict rapidly escalating again at any point if there's a miscalculation or if either side thinks that whatever peace is brokered has been essentially breached by the other side. Iran's negotiating position is hardlined to that compared to seen in previous negotiation rounds called the 12-day war of 2025. And there's a level of mistrust there that's going to be difficult to counteract for any negotiations. As Alice mentioned, it's a lot more likely that there's going to be some sort of piecemeal agreement or partial agreement made on the future of the Strait of Hormuz. So there is a de-escalation, but not a full cessation of the conflict. All of the active drivers from all parties remain active as well. So, for instance, the US and Israeli goals of regime change, of degrading nuclear capability, of hitting the conventional missile capabilities, they remain active. So it's difficult to declare a decisive victory when those goals have not been met. And also, Israel has clearly stated they are not interested in a cessation of conflict until their more foundational war aims are met. And their aims were always essentially the destruction of the political system that is underpinning the Islamic Republic of Iran, which, as we've discussed, is still intact. So in the shorter term, while the overall goal is a lasting deal, a partial face-saving de-escalation around the Strait of Hormuz is potentially likely, but overall we're saying a total cessation of conflict is unlikely in the short and medium term. So that's our possible scenarios, and we're just going to move on now to back to you, Rob. In previous weeks, we have focused on operational guidance, but we moved away from that this week because that stayed fairly static in the past 10 to 14 days. But we're going to be covering what we're going to be watching closely in the coming weeks in terms of signals and future indicators. These are what organizations should be incorporating into their own monitoring, as these will be crucial in determining risk thresholds, risk appetites. So if you could start us off by going through the tactical and military indicators that we'll be monitoring.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. The most obvious one, which we've already alluded to, is the presence or the buildup of US military forces, particularly ground forces. So not just the two MEUs that Alice mentioned earlier, but also the airborne elements that have just been warned off. And there's a couple of points to make here. The first one is, as I think one of the earlier slides said, this isn't just about posturing or demonstrating. It provides a real capability on the ground. So it gives options to the coalition planners. And it also increases important advantage. But the counter side to that is that it's really expensive. So even high readiness forces, if you deploy them, they have to be sustained. So they need food, fuel, water, they need medical facilities, and critically in this kind of environment, they need force protection. So even if they're not deployed, they are a very attractive, high value, high payoff target for Iran. So if you're going to deploy them and not use them, it's a good way of testing them, but it's risky, and it also causes wear and tear on the soldiers themselves, who might enjoy the novelty of deploying overseas, but they don't like being sent somewhere and not used. Thirdly, it's actually not a very big force, and although it sounds like a lot of people, two Marine Expeditionary Units, they're only brigade-sized formations, and actually probably smaller. And the elements of it's the ready elements of the 82nd that will be going, which are it's not a full division. So it's quite a small force, and it doesn't give you much of a presence on the ground. And if you look at the terrain on Iran's coastline in particular, that force is not well suited to it. Well, it's not well suited to invading Iran, marching through the mountains and capturing cities. So they could seize and hold a piece of ground somewhere, but it's probably not a big one. And it doesn't have to be, this is a really important point, I think, it doesn't have to be an Iranian oil terminal or something like that. There's a lot of options that this gives the planners. They don't have to be offensive. So they could be sent somewhere to secure a port or an airport for the evacuation of US interests from somewhere, to secure a route for the evacuation of US forces from a base, or to reinforce an existing US presence somewhere in the region. So there's a lot of things that this could be for, and it's not just capturing Iranian territory. So I would look past the unit names and all of the stuff that the media get excited about at the kind of capability and equipment that's being moved into the theatre. Things like big developed logistics facilities that suggest they're going to be there for a long time or could be surged if they go somewhere. Engineering vehicles, some mine clearing capabilities, anything that contributes to route mobility or force protection for digging in at scale, and medical facilities, in particular blood stocks, that sort of thing being loaded into theatre. And we got quite a lot of information about that kind of thing in the run-up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And then also the deployment of lower readiness follow-on forces as well, because keeping your what are effectively strategic reserves in a particular place for any length of time is great. But as I said, it's expensive, and so that at some point they will need relief. So let's look for some of the less exciting units following on. There's also the question of new capabilities. There's already been speculation that Iran has used missiles that had a longer range than previously thought to attack Diego Garcia. There's a lot that still isn't clear about that incident, including exactly where the interceptions took place, and so actually how far the missiles went. And missile ranges can be increased or decreased according to the size of the payload, and it's possible that Iran sacrificed any kind of explosive capability to be able to throw their missiles a bit further. So this is not necessarily a question of this is some kind of new missile, and it also doesn't necessarily the value of talking about being able to hit Europe massively outweighs the actual the threat outweighs the need for the capability, if you like. And as Alice mentioned earlier, in terms of the packages that Iran is using, there's been an increasing use of UAVs recently, but there are also reports that of the ballistic missiles that they're using slightly more advanced ones recently, including ones that can be redirected during the terminal phase, which means that they're air defense units. And so if that kind of thing is confirmed, it obviously implies Iran has a degree of capability that had previously not been anticipated. The other factor I think we should be watching is the Gulf of Oman. A number of US naval vessels are loitering. They're not in the Persian Gulf yet. They're not passing through the Straits of Hormuz. They're positioned off the coast of Oman. The Houthis are the dog that so far haven't really, well, they've barked, but they certainly haven't started biting yet. They are a separate threat that the US forces will have to address. They have to monitor it in case they do carry out on their threats. And if Iran activates them, then they can increase pressure through attacks on Saudi, Qatar, and so forth, forcing GCC countries to put more pressure on the US to end the war. And also, just the final point, I'd like to make highlight the difference between what you might call editorial fatigue and actual de-escalation. There are already signs that the Western media are losing, but they're not as excited now as they were a couple of weeks ago about this war. You don't really have the rolling news updates on the front pages of online press. They've been relegated to sidebars or buttons at the top. And really, it's only escalation that's going to get it back on to the front pages. So the key takeaway for that is you need an information service that is focused on what is going on, not just the stuff that's spectacular enough to publish.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob. And I'll just cover off some of the political signals and indicators that we're going to be monitoring. I think some of these are quite obvious. So, for instance, confirmed talks between credible negotiation teams between the US and Iran is going to be really important. As we've seen, this is being talked about in the abstract at the moment. We don't really know the who and the where. And obviously, it's not going to be stuff that's really publicly available, but we're still going to be monitoring exactly the progress of these negotiations, whether we think that they're verifiable, what are the veracity of the claims related to the negotiations as well. Clear public red lines set out by the US, Israel, and Iran. This is mostly relating to, are all involved parties actually setting their red lines into a space which is going to be negotiable? For instance, we look at the US saying that one of their red lines is that Iran needs to totally give up its nuclear capabilities. That seems highly unlikely, and from a negotiation standpoint, isn't conciliatory enough to get anywhere. If that's a red line, then there is going to be no negotiated solution. Iran will also have its red lines, which will be unpalatable to both the US and Israel. So that is something we will be monitoring to see if it moves the dial in terms of how conciliatory all of the involved parties are going to be. It's going to be interesting to see if there is any public gaps between Israel and the US's stated war aims. As mentioned, Israel's war aims are more foundational when it comes to Iran than the United States. We've obviously had a debate before about what actually are the US's military objectives. And it seems like they are honing in on degrading missile capability. There's less talk of regime change because that seems incredibly unlikely. Whilst that remains something at the top of Israel's list. As mentioned, they want to just completely destroy the political system of Iran to try and eradicate them as a future threat. So it'll be interesting to see if this plays out publicly at any point, especially if Israel starts to think that the US is making clear indications that it wants to scale back or indeed actually remove itself from the conflict. And also, what is the messaging looking like from Iran? As we've seen so far, there has been belligerent responses about the potential for negotiations. There's been a strength projection there saying, we are not interested in negotiations. We are prepared to continue the fight and absorb even more pain. As Rob mentioned, it is highly likely that this is a tactic, and this is part of the overall ambiguity of war. So we'll be closely monitoring the Iranian negotiation strategy around this. I'm passing back to you, Rob, for the economic signals.
Yeah, we've already mentioned that there is passage of the Straits of Hormuz, but that's for shipping to so-called non-hostile countries, so primarily China, Russia, and India. So it'll be interesting to see if Iran offers any unmolested passage to other operators, for example, for the payment of a toll or some kind of tariff. That would almost certainly fall foul of US sanctions, but it would pose an interesting dilemma for the EU, which is do they pay it and sort of prevail upon the Americans to allow them to do that, or do they message to their population that actually no, you've got to suck up higher energy prices, which will eventually feed through into higher prices across the board, and exacerbate the already very poor economic conditions in some countries in the region. The other point is the restrictions of important exports. So far, we've not seen any obviously related moves from China and Russia specifically in response to this conflict, but there are reports that they're tightening the restrictions that are already in place around things like rare earth metals, gallium, and so forth, the dual-use ones that are particularly of use in things like surveillance sensors and the component parts for precision-guided weapons. And there are reports that they're slow walking permits rather than necessarily tightening up the restrictions. They're just making it harder. They're putting bureaucratic delays in the way, and all of those things can have that's compounding the effect of the impact on sectors like agriculture and manufacturing that Alice alluded to earlier.
Sure. Thank you very much, Rob. And we're just going to quickly move on to questions. So we've got a question that comes in here saying the conflict has persisted beyond initial expectations. I agree with that. In this context, question arises whether the upcoming Football World Cup could exert any influence on a potential cessation of hostilities, given that the security risk associated with such a major international event would otherwise be considered exceptionally high. My own personal opinion on this is that as the World Cup approaches, this will probably be one of numerous potentially pressure points that other countries try to pressure the US into scaling back their involvement in the conflict. Whether that is successful, I don't know. We haven't really seen any of these pressure points which have been pushed, which have been particularly successful in that. But also, in a slightly shameless plug here, we are running a webinar on the FIFA World Cup and the security risks around the FIFA World Cup tomorrow. And if you want any more information about that, please get in contact with us. And we've also got a question here, which is for those of us who have already left the region, how can we judge when it may be safe or safer to return? Rob, probably potentially one for you.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer, and it's not dissimilar from the trap that governments got themselves into around lockdown. Once you've locked down, when is it safe enough to unlock, as it were? Funnily enough, I was speaking to some friends who recently left Dubai at the weekend, and they were asking advice about this. And fortunately, one of them's a trader. and he prepared himself. He prepared his portfolio against the war specifically. And I said to him, well, like a good indication would be, when are you prepared personally to unwind your, risk off portfolio? When are you ready to start going back into other things? That would be a useful indicator. If you're putting your money in that, betting on a de-escalation, it's probably a reasonable assumption that soon after that you think it's going to be safe enough. So that's not advice for everyone, but everyone needs to work out their own risk appetite. And then set themselves some reasonably clear indicators and hold themselves to it and challenge themselves around that. Is it safe? How much longer are we prepared to work remotely? How much longer are we prepared to accept the costs of operating outside this country? Not just the economic costs, but I guess also the reputational costs of being seen to have abandoned your hosts. Yeah, that's not a particularly helpful answer, I guess, but that's one of the lenses you could look through it.
Thank you very much, Rob. And that's all we have time for. So as mentioned, the webinar recording will be circulated shortly. It can be watched on demand, it can be shared, and we'll also post it on our website. Please keep an eye on our Middle East hub, where we're going to be posting, as mentioned, our publications and content related to the Middle East. And we will be in contact about any further briefings that are stood up related to the Middle East. Thank you very much to Alice and Rob for joining me today, and thank you for tuning in to our Middle East briefing.